righty, good evening, everybody. We are going to be finishing up tonight the awfulness of sin and sin destroys man. We're going to finish that one up tonight. We've been working on it now for 3 weeks. But we don't have much to finish on it, so we have a new lesson you should have seen on your way in. And so if you need one of the new ones, Kelly's got them here in the back. Oh, we got quite a few takers here. Okay. A couple over here. And Bill over there. She need one back here. She need one. Okay, and for those of you who might not have the one we've been working on for 3 weeks now, I have a copy or two of it here. Okay. You might just be too afraid to say, I'm not going to raise my hand for that. Okay, there you go. There you go. So we are wrapping this one up. We're down in the point 4. Don't you bring him coloring pages? So we had began to conclude this section here talking about, we spent some time talking about sin and its relationship to our physical nature, and then we began to set into this discussion here about our spiritual nature and talking about, okay, if you were to describe our nature to someone else, what is our what's our nature as human beings? What are we composed of? Breaks down to 2 things. Yeah, body, spirit, soul. Spirit, soul, synonymous terms. The heart sometimes are again synonymous terms. And so we're talking about sin destroying our spiritual nature, and we spoke about the first way. There we touched on about being deceived. Now, when we talk about Satan and the way that he works, what portion of, if you were to break this down, I don't know if to say percentage or what, but when it comes to deception, is that, his first tool out of the tool bag or one that he rarely uses? Yeah, I mean, it's the way that he operates is through deception and lies. He is the father of lies. And so the primary way that sin destroys us human beings is through deception. Now, we talked about this, about the truth that is all around us. What truth is all around us? So I want to highlight this one more time. What truth is all around us? Okay, so, yeah, the creation, that which is created is all around us. That is truth. And there's a great verse in Psalms, chapter 19, verse 1, that talks about the heavens declare, the glory of God. And day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge about who He is. We've talked about this a bajillion times in Romans chapter 1, that through what has been made, that none are without excuse, right? All are held accountable because that which is God's eternal attributes are what? Clearly seen. They are made clear in us and to us. And so truth is all around us. Now that's just what we would call general revelation or general truth, right? But there's specific truth, specific revelation. What would that be? Specific revelation. Yeah, God's Word. And then there's one other avenue of specific revelation. What is that? No. When we talk about, revelation being general and specific revelation, you guys are on the right track. General revelation is creation, right? Specific is the way that God has specifically revealed himself to us, two primary ways. This and one of the, what's that? Yeah. All right, everybody take your hand like this and go like this. All right, it's Jesus. Jesus, while he was on earth, was specific revelation about, it's so obvious, it's like, oh, wait a minute, it can't be it, but that's it. It's Jesus. Yeah, Jesus was specific revelations because it says that we know God because of Jesus through what he did here. So we know more about him in the person of Jesus. And so that's the avenues, the ways that we have this revelation. And so despite the fact that all this truth has been given to us, we are under the influence of sin and we willfully close our eyes to that truth. Now, what is the primary factor or motivation for us willfully closing our eyes to that which is evident? What is the primary factor? Sin. What about it? Yeah, we talk about the sin that we want to live in sin, and therefore we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Yes, so that's what we see in our society, right? Is the suppression of truth, denying the truth, denying God's existence in order to live life the way that you want to live life, right? Almost every system that denies, like an atheistic or agnostic system, does so in order to allow the individual to have autonomy and to live their life as they choose. Now, we also talk about religious systems that do the same thing, that are outside of Christianity or Judaism. We talked about one of those this morning, right? So there was a religious system in Canaan, right, that was very much based in sexuality and immorality, right? And so they devised a system that said, this is worship. And so they denied God, the one true God. So there's different ways that this can manifest. But it's all through deception and lies. This is why sinners suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so we talked about this. Sin deceives, but God's word is truth. So we have deceit, but then we started to get into this idea of being depraved. Now, in the Restoration Movement as a whole, and those that are not of a Calvinistic persuasion, the word depraved is kind of like, it's a hot potato, right? We're a little bit afraid to use that word. Why? What is it about that we tend to shy away from that idea of discussing depravity or being depraved? Yes, because they take it to the extreme of total depravity, right? We're familiar with the TULIP acronym. We've talked about this many times. And so the TULIP acronym of total depravity, that's the starting point, right? And total depravity is based on the idea of original sin. We trace this back to the ideas of Augustine, and then it comes down to us and through Calvin and others. And so, but to say total depravity is one thing. To say depraved or depravity is another to some extent. It's like a pendulum. Now they say, the Calvinists, that sinners are totally unable to believe in Jesus because they're totally depraved. They're so darkened in their understanding and mind that they cannot think a good thought. They cannot make a move towards God in any way. And so that's a real problem. We've talked about this before, because you really have issues then with what idea? If you're totally depraved and you can't choose God for yourself, then that limits what? What is that? Free will, right? And so I firmly believe that free will is one of the greatest gifts, if not the greatest gift, that God has bestowed upon mankind in His creation. And we talked about this before. The greatest commandment presupposes free will, right? Eric talked about this in his communion meditation this morning, right? Greatest commandments? right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, might, strength, soul, right? And then love your neighbor as yourself. Love presupposes free will, right? Is love really love if it's not free, freely chosen? It's not. If you could make somebody love you, is that really love? I mean, we've talked about this before. You could program a robot to show you affection and do all the things that love does, right? Yep. Do all the loving, all that. But it's not really love because you've programmed it. And so that thing has no free will, and therefore love. So love presupposes free will. The greatest commandment presupposes, or it's based in love, so therefore free will is based in that greatest commandment. And so free will is a very real thing, and we must seek to, whatever theology we develop or anthropology about the nature of man, we must preserve free will. If we do anything that limits free will, then we're headed down a road that's a real problem. And so we got to make sure that we don't go down that road. So depravity is to the soul what disease is to the body. Sin in the form of sinful desires and sinful acts takes root in the spiritual aspect of our nature. Our spiritual strength in terms of being able to resist temptation and say no to sin gets weaker and weaker. So what happens when an individual sets down a path into a certain lifestyle or sin? At first, there may be hesitation, but then what happens? Easier and easier and easier till they become completely numb to any idea of it being wrong, right? That's what we see. And so, this idea, and the further you get along that line, the more you justify those kind of actions. The soul becomes empty of the characteristic known as virtue, such as love and kindness and meekness and self-control, and it becomes marked by those characteristics known as vices, such as covetousness, lust, pride, and hatred. The Apostle Paul refers to this sinfulness of the soul as a state of spiritual death, as being dead in your trespasses and sin, Ephesians 2:1 and 2:5, and Colossians 2:13. Calvinists take this to the extreme of total depravity, saying that the sinner is unable to believe the gospel until regenerated, right? So regeneration, where the soul is made alive in the Calvinist system, takes place when? Right? It takes place for the individual first. So the first thing that happens is you are regenerated, illuminated by God, your spirit's made alive, and then you're saved later on. Right? So the New Testament, I believe, clearly teaches us that the regeneration, when the soul is made alive again, occurs when? At baptism, right? When we were dead in our trespasses and sin, and we rise and walk in newness of life. The newness of life that occurs is our spirit being made alive within us. And so Calvinists take this to the extreme, saying that the sinner is unable to believe the gospel until regenerated. Colossians 2:12 shows that this is a false extreme, though, since Paul here teaches that the sinner is regenerated, raised from the state of spiritual death through faith, right? We talked about that this morning. Faith is the primary prerequisite. So if you have a person that is repentant and confessing Jesus as Lord, but doesn't really believe in Jesus, and then is baptized, what do you have? You have a pretty good person who got wet. Someone who's trying to live maybe a right way, but if they don't have faith in Jesus, then, like you said, you have a person who just got baptized, who's confessing Jesus as Lord. They're saying the right things, but they don't have faith in Him. Then what you have is a person who's basically trying to live a good life who just got wet one time. And so faith in Jesus Christ is the prerequisite, trusting in Him for His work that He did upon the cross, that righteousness that is imputed to us, it's given to us, it's accounted to our accounts, and so that is through faith. Now, to avoid this false interpretation of the death references, it is more practical to think of depravity in terms of spiritual disease, as in Jeremiah 17:9, right? Keith, you told me you talked about this in your class. what Jeremiah 17:9 says about the heart. The heart is full of good and leads you down the right path. What does it say? Yeah, is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. What do we see all the time, right? You see this every time, like when someone's got faced with a life decision in the world, and what does everybody say? Just follow your heart. I'm sorry, that's bad advice. In Isaiah 1, chapter 5, Isaiah 1, 5 and 6, verses 5 and 6, the prophet draws a picture of what the depraved soul would look like if we could see it as we see the body. If we could see the sinful soul thus, how would it appear? Quote, the whole head is sick and the whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head there is nothing sound in it, only bruises, welts, and raw wounds, not pressed out or bandaged, nor softened with oil. This shows us that sin is not just an action one performs, it's a condition in which one exists, what an enemy sin is. So, deceived and depraved and defenseless. Now, one other way sin destroys our spiritual nature is that it leaves us defenseless against our personal enemies, Satan and his demonic spirits. Though Satan is bound in this church age in the sense that he is unable to deceive whole nations, he is still able to prowl around like a roaring lion and attacks us individuals, especially through his minions through his minions, the demons or evil spirits. Paul describes them as the rulers and powers and world forces of darkness. Ephesians 6:12, quote, the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now we saw again that Satan's main weapon is what? It's deceit, with which he attacks our minds, but he and the other fallen angels also attacked our wills. They attack our minds through deceit, but they also attack our will through. So deceit happens, but there's something else that happens when they attack our will, right? And that is temptation. Right? Temptation. Through temptation, and they stand ready also. This can occur to invade our bodies through demonization, also called demon possession. Some think the demons are not active in the world today, but this is one of Satan's dangerous lies. They are still real and are still active, and sinners are defenseless against them without the armor of God that God supplies to us as Christians. Now, the earliest generations of Christians in the first centuries of the church assumed that, this is interesting, because this came up in our Sunday school class. The earliest generations of Christians in the first few centuries of the church assumed that all pagans were demonized and under the control of demons. Thus, when they were preparing converts for baptism into Christ, a regular part of the preparation was an exorcism service in which the convert renounced the devil and his demons and was anointed with oil. I once asked a respected church leader if he believed anyone is demonized in our time. His reply surprised me yet pleased me. He said, I believe, they all are. The reason I'm laughing about that is because we had a very interesting discussion. Now, this is interesting. I don't know if I can go that far, but I do think we do not take the demonic threat seriously enough. We cannot take for granted that just because we are Christians, we don't have to worry about such possibilities. After all, when Paul said, quote, therefore take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, he was giving a command to whom? To Christians. Without the armor, we are all defenseless against these enemies. Now, in this lesson, we've tried to show how awful sin is by outlining the ways in which sin destroys us as human beings. It destroys our relationship with God and the world in which we live. It also destroys our very nature in both body and our spirit. Now, we don't want to end, though, without giving at least a summary of how any sinner can be delivered from the destructive enemy of sin. We usually speak of salvation as God's double cure of grace, using the phrase from the old hymn. Which old hymn talks about the double cure? Yes, Rock of Ages. We like to point out if there is a double cure, then there must be a double trouble or a double curse from which we are being delivered. I'm not sure whether we do this justice, though, to God's salvation by calling it just a double cure. Maybe it's a triple or quadruple cure, or maybe even more. If we could think up a word that represents 12 ways that God saves us from sin's destruction, the point is simply this. 1 John 4:4, greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. God is greater than sin in every respect. As someone has said, sin is the destroyer, but God is the restorer. Sin makes us desolate and separated from God, but God restores us to fellowship with himself. Sin makes us detested by God, but through the blood of the Son, we are reconciled to God. Sin makes us damned to hell, but Jesus takes our punishment upon himself and brings us forgiveness and freedom from condemnation. Sin sinks our physical universe into depths of disruption and decay and distortion, but through the power of Jesus' resurrection, this whole universe will one day be replaced by a new heavens and a new earth in which dwells not sin, but righteousness. Sin makes our bodies diseased and dead and dominated by sin, but God, through Jesus Christ, will raise us up into new, glorified, eternal bodies at Christ's second coming. Sin subjects our spirits to deception, but God, revealed and inspired word, shows us the truth. Sin infects our spirits with spiritual disease and death, but in our baptism, God raises us up with Christ and sets us on the road to final and complete spiritual health. Sin strips us of our defenses against our enemies, but Jesus defeated those enemies in his work of death and resurrection and shares that victory with us. And here is our battle cry: death to the destroyer and all hail to the victor. So that is sin destroys man. Now the next one is one that you may not have thought about. Now before we move on, do we have any questions or comments about the what we just covered here? I know the air's on, but I am burning up. Whew. Yeah, I know. Isn't it amazing? All right, I know I'm probably out of the picture. Is this thing on? Wonder if I can lean over. Whoo-wee. Oh, no, that's okay. No, up there is where we're... Hot flash, yeah. Yeah, I'm stage 2 menopause. Menopause? Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to be talking about the awfulness of sin, and that sin despises the law. Now, you probably at first are like, yeah. I mean, the verse there, 1 John 3:4 at the top of your paper, sin is lawlessness. There's so much in this lesson, though. I mean, this is rich, and it's very, very important. And what I've come to find out, and as we've worked our way through this, probably one of, if not the most influential class I ever took in Bible college or seminary was the doctrine of grace that Dr. Cottrell taught. And this, what we're getting ready to set into right here, this lesson here, talking about sin despises the law, is really one of the most fundamental and impactful understandings that came out of that class. And time after time, when things come up on Facebook, you'll see individuals that said, you know, this changed my life, these understandings. As a Christian, these are people, you know, these are preachers and people that, you know, that are in seminary, and, you know, and so I really want to state here that some of these understandings of grace and law and all this. It just makes so much sense of it all because there's so much misunderstanding. See, if you mention the word law to most people, they will probably think of like criminal law, right? Or civil law, or the laws of the land, or the law and order. But if you say, no, I'm talking about law as in the Bible, the first thing that will probably come up is what? Yeah, the law of Moses. But here when we say law, we're referring to something more fundamental than either of these kinds of law. Oh, well, okay. So when we talk about criminal law, civil law, laws of the land, law and order, the law of Moses, those are expressions of something that actually is more foundational than even those laws themselves. You might be thinking, well, the Ten Commandments, that's the starting point, right? Right. So there are certain fundamental laws that are actually at the bedrock fundamental where these things come out of those. And this is the understanding, and when we talk about this, hopefully this will become more clear as we move along. So when we talk about this, we're referring to something more fundamental than either of these kinds of law. We're thinking mainly of God's moral law. The fundamental laws and rules and regulations that apply to all human beings and at all times and all places. Was the law of Moses applicable to all people in all times? No, it's very specific and narrow, right? Now, because those fundamental general principles, those moral law codes they find themselves expressed in the Ten Commandments, right? Because we talked about this, right? I should know these in order. But when it says do not murder, right? So it wasn't wrong till Moses brought it down off the mountain. When was it wrong? From the very beginning. Had Eve had it with Adam and conked him on the head with a rock, that would have been wrong then too, right? That would have been problematic for all of us. Yeah. Been like, oh, well, I guess we'll have to start over somehow. But now notice I said Eve conking Adam on the head because he would be the one to deserve it, right? Yeah. Well, anyway, it was always wrong from the beginning. So we're talking about these fundamental moral laws that are in place that are applicable to all people in all times and all places. These are the basic rules of right and wrong. They are the laws that govern every person's relationship with God and with one another. The moral law is the laws that apply to us just because we are human beings created by God. Now, so the moral law applies to which humans? Yeah, everybody. This is the universal law code given by the Creator to His human creatures. There are other laws that God gives to specific people and specific groups of people in specific times and for specific purposes. For example, God had special law commands for Noah and for Abraham, and he had a whopper of a special law code for the Israelite nation. Again, the law of Moses. There are some law commands in the New Testament that have been given just for those who are living now in the New Covenant era. For some reason, laws that fit into this category are called positive laws as distinct from the moral law. The biblical writings include both positive, limited laws and the universal moral law. In the New Testament, even though some laws are new and apply only in this church age, all right, so you're probably like, wait a minute, what? There's new laws in the New Covenant? There are commands that are limited to the New Covenant that aren't found elsewhere? Yeah. She gets a million points because it says the Lord's Supper right here. Excellent. Yeah. When we talk about Certainly the things that are associated with the gospel commands. So even though some laws are new and apply only in this church age, instructions about the Lord's Supper, most of it is ethical teaching, is just the universal moral law be given in written form. The moral law of God is as fundamental a part of the universe as are the laws of physics. So when we talk about the laws of physics, what laws of physics are universal in nature and have always been, always will be? Yeah, well, the one we always think of right away is gravity, right? Yeah, or a force acting upon another thing. You know, you talk about the kind of things that we know about physics. If I were to push this, then we would know so there's a certain reaction that would take place. Go ahead. Yes, that's actually that's actually a quote from Deuteronomy. Yeah, yeah. So the Shema, the Lord God is one, and love the Lord your God with all your heart, is quoted from the Old Testament. You're welcome. Now, the moral law of God is as fundamental a part of the universe as are the laws of physics or natural laws. They are just as necessary as the law of physics for an orderly universe. This is why sin is so stinking awful. Sin is lawlessness. The very essence of sin is to despise the law of God. In this sense, every sinner is a true scofflaw. Scofflaw. S-C-O-F-F-L-A-W. Anybody use that word like ever? Scofflaw? I guess one that despises and scoffs the law. That's a new one for me. Sin is an attack upon the very fabric of the universe, upon its moral law and order. Now here we're going to explain why sin is so awful, because it despises the law of God. So the first thing we're going to look at here is God and law. So when we understand this, we recognize that God is the source of the law. The Bible describes God as a lawgiver. Isaiah 33:22 says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king." James 4:12 repeats some of this. There is only one lawgiver and judge, God himself. I tell you, we could spend some time talking about this. And if I'm going back in my mind to the discussion that when we did our God and Country ? That was based in our studies that we had from the Truth Project at one time, that we understand that every law is based upon an ethical notion, regardless of who you are that's trying to make a law. If you're making a law, it's based upon an ethical notion. It's in this day and age as to who or what that ethical notion is based upon itself. And if we understand, as I believe our founders did, that law itself finds its source in God, then we go to Him for the foundation of our laws that were built upon His law. Right? And so God is the source of law, and then God is the pattern for the law. The law mirrors God's own holy nature and will. This answers the question, how does God decide what commandments to bind upon us? How does He decide His creatures, to bind upon us His creatures? Remember, He made us in His own image, thus He wants us to be like Him. But like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, 1 Peter 1:15 and 16, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Now here Peter quotes Leviticus chapter 11, verses 44 and 45. Now this is true specifically for what we have called the moral law in the introduction above. This moral law is written, first and foremost, where is the moral law written? if it's applicable to everybody, in all times and all places, it's written upon our hearts. It is something that is intuitive to us. And so it's written on the heart of every human being, Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, as part of what it means to be made in God's image. The Old Testament contains many of the law commands that are part of the moral law, but the law of Moses specifically includes many instructions intended only for Israel under the Old Covenant. The latter would include laws governing temple worship procedures, right? So, temple worship procedures, we got to follow those laws right here. Why? Because they were for a specific people in a specific time and place. And so, as well as laws governing the details of Israel's social life, these positive laws are reflections of God's moral character only in a very general sense. The same would apply to a few positive laws of the New Covenant Scriptures. The point is that most of God's laws ultimately represent this one thing, His own holy character or nature. All of His laws are expression of His holy will. All right, and I think the last thing that we're going to talk about here is, well, we might have time to do both here. God has a purpose for the law. There's a purpose behind the law. And that purpose is determined by His love for us. In fact, everything about the creation of this universe is related to His love. The two main purposes of creation are these. God created for the purposes of displaying His glory and sharing His goodness. Now, we are thinking here especially about the latter. God made us human beings in His own image so that He could have a love relationship with us and share His goodness with us. And this is why He wants us to be holy as He is holy, because He loves us and wants us to be happy, and He knows that lives lived in imitation of His own holy character will be the happiest. But where are the guidelines for such a holy and happy life? How do we know that what God's holy character is? Well, we see God's holy character expressed in the law. This is what the law is all about. God's holy nature is verbalized for us in His law. God's commandments show us His holiness. Thus, the law of God shows us how to live according to His purpose for us. It is the manufacturer's instruction book on how to match our moral character with that of God Himself. God has a purpose for the law. It reveals His holy nature, and it provides the path for a loving relationship with Him. Now, the goodness of the law is now made clear. Because of all the above, Romans 7:16 says the law is good. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. God made the law great and glorious in Isaiah 42:21. His commandments are not burdensome, 1 John 5:3. The law is for us. Have you ever thought about this? That the law is for us, not against us. Now think about, most of society would say the law is out to get you. It's against us. It's to harm us. It's to control us. It's to hem us in and keep us from doing what we want to do, right? But when we understand the law, tracing it back to this moral law that finds its nature in God's, that finds its home in God's nature, and that is expressed in and through His holiness, that we need to understand that His commandments are not burdensome and that the law is for us and not against us. When you make a rule for your child, is it because you're against them? Yes. And normally those rules and things are for what purpose? For their protection, their safety, their benefit. Does the child see it that way? No. Sometimes are we little children in relationship to God's law? See, we talk about freedom. We talk about freedom And unfortunately, we as human beings don't look at it the right way. Is you can, and I've thought about it this way, and maybe you guys can help me to refine this metaphor. But that God has given us like a playpen, right? If you ever seen those fancy ones now that like an octagon, and you can set up in your living room, and they're good. You know, they used to have the little old wood one, right? It's about 4x4, right? Look like a prison cell, right? But now they got those ones that are kind of plasticky, and they're pretty good size, and you can kind of shape them the way you want them. And so if you think of us in relationship, I kind of think that God's laws are represented in that barrier. And then that on the outside of that barrier is danger and harm, the hot stove, the fireplace, Dad's toolbox, the road, all the things that could harm us. But when you're in that playpen, if you just recognize that for what it is, then you have complete freedom within those parameters. Is enjoy the freedom that you have in that moment, but what happens to us? What does Satan trick us into doing? All I can pay attention to is the wall itself, and I want to be over there. And we don't realize that, and because we say we feel hemmed in or constrained. No, enjoy the freedom that you've been given, understanding that when you get on the other side of that there's danger. Because God's holiness, represented by those things, will protect us if we stay inside of it. Represented in those laws. The law is for us, not against us. God wants us to obey it, not just because He's the boss, which He is, but also because He loves us. And so that's where we're going to stop tonight. We will pick up next week with sinners and law, and this is where we're really going to get into this understanding of what the difference is between the law code and the law system. We've talked about this in other forms and formats before, but this really gets into it and helps us to understand the law code and law system and why it's important to have those distinctions. And the way this plays out in the book of Romans, it's really fascinating. All right, any questions or comments?